Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of information and unearth the most important insights, giving you a shortcut to being truly well-informed.
Today, we're plunging into a truly fascinating web of secret diplomacy and shifting alliances in the Middle East. Our focus, these surprising, really under-the-radar connections that started forming between Israel and several Sunni Arab states.
Yeah, we're talking decades of clandestine meetings, intelligence sharing, even these intricate business deals that dramatically reshaped regional dynamics.
Absolutely.
We're going to untangle what actually brought these, historical adversaries together, how these relationships quietly evolved, and the really high-stakes internal debates within Israel about how best to confront what they saw as a shared threat. So what's our core mission today?
Okay, our mission is to understand how a mutual profound fear of Iran's nuclear ambitions and, frankly, its regional dominance spurred this unlikely alignment across the Middle East. We'll explore the key figures, the critical moments that built these covert bridges, and also the intense disagreements that came up over the most effective strategy to counter Iran. Get ready for some, unexpected revelations, I think.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We're talking about traditional adversaries like Israel and Sunni Gulf states, particularly the UAE and Saudi Arabia, suddenly finding common ground. What was the driving force behind this really dramatic shift?
Well, the core reason was a shared profound concern over Iran's nuclear program and its broader ambitions to dominate the Muslim world.
Right.
Our sources highlight that while Iran's public threats were mostly aimed at Israel, the Ayatollahs also viewed Sunni Arabs, whom they sometimes referred to using pretty derogatory slurs, as near equal enemies.
Wow.
So you basically had two groups, historically at odds, both facing what they perceived as an existential threat from the same source.
So that shared threat, it kind of superseded the traditional enmities. How did that actually play out in the early stages? Like, specifically, how far back do these secret ties between Israel and the UAE really go?
Surprisingly far back, to the early 1990s, actually, right after the Oslo Accords.
Okay.
That period, it opened some cautious, maybe fragile new avenues for engagement between Israel and some Arab states. The Emiratis, already quite worried about Iran, wanted to buy advanced F-16 fighter jets from the Clinton administration.
Right.
But they needed Israel's blessing, specifically Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin's government, to lift any objections they might have. Using Mossad connections, they set up a meeting in Geneva.
In Geneva.
Yes, between Rabin's bureau chief, Shimon Sheaves, and Mohammed bin Zayed, or MBZ, who would later become crown prince. Rabin agreeing to okay the F-16s, that was a foundational moment. It really built that initial trust.
Okay, so building on that foundation, how did Ariel Sharon's strategy, his vision, further deepen these connections once he became prime minister? What was his approach to Iran and the Gulf, and how did he put that into action?
Sharon, he understood this dynamic very well, intuitively. He told his Mossad chief, Mir Dagan, to not only penetrate Iran's nuclear program, but also to actively strengthen ties with the Arab Gulf nations.
Okay.
So in 2004, Dagan gave this task to David Maiden. Maiden was moved to head Mossad's Tevel division. That's the part responsible for dealings with foreign intelligence organizations and countries Israel didn't have formal ties with. Maiden and his analysts started making secret contacts, and they found a receptive audience in the UAE, Bahrain, and also Saudi Arabia.
Right. Maiden clearly built on that sort of slender thread from the F-16 deal. What were his initial impressions of the UAE, and how did these ties deepen from that point?
Maiden really saw the UAE as Israel's best chance to forge a genuinely new situation with the Sunni Arab world. He recalled, once we found a connection in the UAE, we started communicating, but everything was clandestine.
Everything's secret.
And each side made sure nothing leaked to the press. He praised the UAE for having the most guts, calling them a very daring nation, with talented, seasoned leaders. Way ahead, he thought, of everyone else in the region.
So once these initial connections were made, how did the level of engagement evolve? What was the sort of natural progression of these meetings?
Oh, the meetings absolutely became more high level. After his appointment in 2005, Maiden held meetings in Europe with Sheikh Hassan bin Zayed, who was the UAE National Security Advisor and MBZ's brother.
Okay.
Later that same year, he met both Sheikh Hassan and MBZ, now the Crown Prince, at the Royal Palace in Abu Dhabi.
Right there in Abu Dhabi.
Yes. And then in early 2006, Dagan himself went with Maiden. They took a private jet to Abu Dhabi, but they stopped briefly in Jordan.
To cover the tracks.
Exactly, to ensure there was no record of a direct flight from Israel. Maiden actually called this the launch party for the relationship. After that, a former Mossad agent was stationed in the Emirates full-time to manage ties. And Maidane, who was fluent in Arabic, often met solo with senior officials, really building deep relationships and starting to explore future business and even defense industry ties.
So, with these deeply established secret ties, how did that contrast with the public face of these relationships? What was the tension between that private reality and the public perception?
Oh, it was a very stark contrast. Diplomatic cables, which later came out via WikiLeaks, showed that even Israel's foreign minister at the time, Tzipi Livni, had formed close ties with the UAE foreign minister, Abdullah bin Zayed, another MBZ brother. Yet, Mark Sievers from the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv explicitly noted the Emiratis would simply not do in public what they say behind closed doors. There was this deep, deep need to maintain public distance despite the growing private collaboration.
But despite that need for public distance, we did see a sitting Israeli minister publicly visit the UAE at one point, didn't we?
Yes, that's right. In 2010, Uzi Landau, who was Israel's Minister of Infrastructure and known as a hardliner,
Right, a hardliner.
attended a conference in Abu Dhabi. It was actually the first visit by a sitting Israeli minister, and it subtly paved the way for a permanent Israeli presence at the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, which is based there.
And behind that public radar, it sounds like business and defense ties were just flourishing. Can you give us an example, like how deep did this covert cooperation actually go?
Yeah, one of the earliest and probably most significant examples was Mati Kochabi's 2008 contract. It was huge, $800 million.
$800 million.
Yes, to supply advanced security surveillance equipment to the UAE, funneled through a Swiss holding company.
Ah, the Swiss cover.
Exactly. A Bloomberg report detailed how, at the project's peak, twice a week, a chartered all-white Boeing 737 flew from Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi.
Twice a week.
Twice a week. It would make a brief stop in Cyprus or Jordan for, quote, political cover, carrying dozens of Israeli engineers, many with intelligence backgrounds. There were even rumors suggesting Mossad officials sometimes hitched rides on these flights to expand their own contacts. It's really quite remarkable when you think about it. Dozens of Israeli engineers, some ex-intelligence, flying into Abu Dhabi regularly under such tight secrecy. The level of trust, the discretion required on both sides, it's extraordinary.
That level of operational detail, it really highlights the deep trust being built.
Okay, what about other Gulf states? We heard mentions of Qatar and Bahrain.
Right. Official trade ties with Qatar and Bahrain, they did exist for a while after Oslo, but these pretty much collapsed after the violence of the Second Intifada that erupted in September 2000. That really froze public relations for years. However, our sources indicate that private relationships may be less overt than with the UAE, but they quietly persisted beneath the surface.
Right now, Saudi Arabia, its history with Israel is, of course, far more complex, much more hostile historically than the UAE's. How did they begin to shift from being so openly hostile to, well, finding common ground with Israel? Historically, yes, the Saudis were extremely hostile. They sent forces in the 1948 War of Independence, made consistently anti-Semitic statements. They were key to the 1973 oil embargo.
Absolutely.
But that old maxim, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, it proved powerful here. Even as early as the 1960s, during the North Yemen Civil War, both Israel and Saudi Arabia were quietly supporting the royalists against Nasser's Egypt.
Interesting. A shared interest even then.
A tactical one, yes.
Yeah.
But the real catalyst, the game changer for deeper engagement, was the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran.
Right.
That event fundamentally pushed the Saudis to realize they had a powerful common interest with Israel, stopping the Ayatollahs from expanding Shiite power across the Sunni world. So informal ties between Mossad and Saudi intelligence started to develop through the 80s and 90s, quietly.
That's a profound shift in geopolitical thinking. When did this common interest start to become more apparent? And maybe not on the public stage, but at least in diplomatic circles.
It became much more apparent in 2006, during the Second Lebanon War. Saudi Arabia took a really vehement stance against Hezbollah, Iran's proxy. They blamed Hezbollah for starting the war, as did several other Arab countries like Egypt.
Okay.
Afterwards, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey quietly agreed to accelerate intelligence exchanges, specifically to counter Iran. And soon after that, Dagan met in Amman, Jordan, not just with his Jordanian counterpart, but also with Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who was head of Saudi intelligence then.
So you have the Saudis maybe focused on their own specific objectives, but Dagan seems to view this as an opportunity for something much broader, right?
Exactly. The Saudis, their primary interest initially was making sure Israel didn't stand in the way of certain big arms deals they wanted from the U.S.
Right, arms deals.
But for Dagan, this meeting in Amman was the starting point. He envisioned forming an axis, as he saw it, between Israel and the moderate Sunni states. Condoleezza Rice, who was U.S. Secretary of State then, she even wrote in her memoirs that when she met with the Gulf Cooperation Council leaders, the GCC, they told her Iran was number 1, 2, 3, and 4 on their agenda. It was everything to them.
And Dagan was quite adept at using his personal connections to facilitate some of this really high-level sensitive diplomacy, wasn't he?
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
Dagan cultivated this close, special relationship with King Abdullah II of Jordan. They even shared a birthday.
Really?
Yeah, they'd call each other, sometimes even celebrate together. These unique personal ties, along with, American introductions, opened critical doors for Dagan to meet other Arab leaders in the region. Now, overall, Israel-Jordan relations, they had their ups and downs.
Sure.
But the Mossad Jordanian intelligence ties, they generally remained close and pretty cordial.
So this growing alignment, fueled by this shared adversary, it led to some truly extraordinary reports, though maybe unconfirmed. What were those claims?
Yes. Arab sources, which interestingly were later found to be surprisingly accurate despite denials from everyone involved,
Right.
reported Dagan actually visiting Saudi Arabia in the summer of 2010 for talks specifically on the Iranian threat.
A Mossad chief in Saudi Arabia?
Exactly. And even more controversially, there were these unconfirmed claims that Saudi Arabia proposed allowing Israeli fighter jets to use their airspace on the way to strike Iran's nuclear facilities.
Use Saudi airspace?
Yes. Some reports even mention landing and refueling, though Israeli sources tend to deny the landing part. But there's pretty persuasive evidence of their willingness to at least facilitate a strike. The former Saudi Foreign Minister Saud al-Faisal reportedly told a Spanish-Israeli journalist, "Tell your friends you can use our airspace." It's pretty direct.
Wow. Okay, so if the Gulf states were deeply concerned about a nuclear Iran and basically wanted someone else to take action and Israel was ready to step up, what was Mayor Dagan's preferred approach? How did he want to counter Iran?
Well, Dagan's core policy, it had 5 pillars, he called them. And one really significant one was to pressure Iran in ways that would create conditions for regime change.
Okay, regime change. How?
This included things like financial sanctions, like those UN Security Council resolutions 1737 and 1747 back in 2006 and 2007. He believed these sanctions were proving very costly to Iran, pushing European businesses out. He argued Iran was paying a really heavy price for nuclear capabilities they hadn't even fully mastered yet. Dagan also strongly advocated for fomenting unrest from within Iran itself.
Internal unrest.
Yes. In August 2007 meeting with the U.S. Under Secretary of State Robert Burns, he identified what he saw as Iran's weak spots. His suggestions included supporting student democracy movements and also ethnic minorities like Azeris, Kurds, Balochs, people who make up maybe 40% of the population and often dislike the regime. He pointed to things like high unemployment over 30%, inflation over 40%. People were criticizing the government for funding groups overseas like Hamas and Hezbollah instead of addressing the misery at home.
That insight raises an important question. How did Dagan's view of Iran's internal dynamics differ from how, say, American and European officials saw things back then?
Well, American and European officials often kind of hoped that a moderate faction could somehow emerge from within Iran and change its aggressive postures. Dagan didn't buy that analysis at all.
No.
He firmly felt that neither the reformist camp nor the hardliners were ideologically moderate towards Israel. He thought both fundamentally wanted its destruction. However, he did recognize that the reformists maybe had a worldview more tempered by reality, which created tactical divisions within Iran that, could potentially be exploited.
And his analysis certainly seemed quite prescient when we look at the Green Movement protests that erupted later, didn't it?
Indeed, it did. In the summer of 2009, you had these massive protests erupt across Iran after Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's re-election, which seemed suspiciously wide to many.
Right.
Millions march, chanting, "Where is my vote?" But crucially, they also chanted a slogan that really stood out. Neither Gaza nor Lebanon. My soul is for Iran.
Powerful.
It powerfully highlighted this widespread public discontent over the regime spending lavishly overseas while domestic needs were suffering badly.
That moment, it really felt like a monumental opportunity. So why didn't Israel or the West manage to seize it? What happened?
Well, many, like Tamir Pardo, who later became Mossad chief himself, felt it was a great chance to assist the opposition. But we missed it.
Missed it.
Yeah. Western intelligence agencies, he believed,
Yeah.
hadn't fully understood just how vulnerable the regime actually was at that moment. Part of the reluctance, stemmed from a desire to avoid repeating the CIA's 1953 coup in Iran. That remained a deep source of Iranian animosity.
Understandable hesitation.
Right. Former Prime Minister Olmert even suggested later that if the U.S. had taken action, some of them violent perhaps, he thought regime change could have been achieved. But President Obama, he was trying very hard to avoid costly foreign interventions after Iraq and Afghanistan.
Right.
And he was just unwilling to take that risk. And without broad international agreement, Mossad felt it couldn't act alone.
So, with Olmert out and Benjamin Netanyahu back in power in 2009, the strategy towards Iran, it shifted pretty notably. What was Netanyahu's stance? And how fundamentally did it differ from Dagon's 5 pillars approach, subversion and sanctions?
Netanyahu and his defense minister, Ehud Barak, they were deeply skeptical that sabotage and subterfuge alone would be enough to actually halt Iran's nuclear program.
They didn't think it was working.
No. They allocated billions of shekels to the Israeli Air Force, specifically to build explicit capabilities for direct attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. Netanyahu saw the Iranian threat in increasingly apocalyptic terms. He famously warned, it's 1938 and Iran is Germany.
Strong words.
Very strong. Emphasizing that Iran's nuclear ambitions must be stopped. They have to be stopped. We all have to stop it now. And this kind of hawkish rhetoric, of course, it resonated very warmly in the Gulf states. It's worth noting, too, Barak had actually pushed for military action much earlier. Back in 2008, he tried hard to convince President George W. Bush to greenlight a preemptive Israeli strike.
And Bush's reaction?
Bush famously told him, no way. And then apparently banging his fist, no means no. Very clear message.
Wow. Okay, let's delve deeper into Israel's internal deliberations then. What kind of stark opposition did this new push for military action encounter within its own security establishment?
This raised a truly monumental question for Israel, and the opposition was indeed stark. Dagon, after he retired, famously called the idea of a direct strike the stupidest idea I ever heard.
Stupidest idea.
That's the quote. He believed Israel should only resort to military action when every single other option was exhausted, if the sword was at our necks. He thought an open strike would just strengthen the mullahs' resolve, unite the Iranian people behind them, and maybe only set the program back a couple of years at best.
And the potential costs.
Huge. He feared pilot casualties, terror attacks against Israeli and Jewish targets worldwide, maybe all-out war with Iranian proxies like Hezbollah, and Israel being left isolated without American support. Dagon, still pushing for clandestine operations, even joked, "Give me another $2 billion and I'll make sure we continue to benefit from divine intervention." He meant covert successes.
And it wasn't just Dagon vocalizing this opposition, right? Who else within the highest levels of Israel's security establishment argued against a strike?
Right. When Netanyahu and Barak ordered the IDF chief of staff, Gabi Ashkenazi and Dagon, to prepare a 30-day countdown for a strike in September 2010, both were reportedly shocked.
Shocked.
Dagon even believed the order itself might be illegal without full cabinet approval. Ashkenazi agreed, saying they would only proceed through a legal process. Ashkenazi also worried that the necessary mobilization of reserves, other unusual activity, it could tip off Iran. You'd lose the crucial element of surprise.
A major concern.
Absolutely. This caution apparently infuriated Barak, who is reported to have said something like, with a chief of staff like that, we wouldn't have won the Six-Day War.
Wow. Harsh.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And Yuval Diskin, who is chief of Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, and other senior security officials, also argued vehemently against it. It was a major internal clash.
And the U.S., they also weighed in quite heavily on this internal Israeli debate, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, Admiral Mike Mullen, reportedly called Ashkenazi directly.
The top U.S. military officer called the top Israeli military officer.
Directly. Asking, essentially, have you gone mad? Are you planning to surprise us? This exceptionally strong opposition from within Israel's own security establishment, combined with that very clear American stance, ultimately led to the plan being dropped. At least, as they said, for the moment.
So what we've really seen today is how this pervasive fear of a nuclear Iran forged these secret, surprising alliances across the Middle East, fundamentally challenging long-held antagonisms. It's quite a testament to how geopolitical pressures can create common ground, even among, well, historical adversaries.
And simultaneously how, even within an allied nation like Israel, You can have these fierce debates, these deep disagreements on the most effective path forward when facing what you see as an existential threat. The intelligence gathered, the diplomatic maneuvers, the sheer nerve involved in these clandestine operations. It's truly remarkable. It highlights a fundamental philosophical divide, doesn't it? How do you confront an existential threat? Is it with the scalpel of covert action or the hammer of direct military force?
It's such a delicate balance, trying to counter a threat while navigating these incredibly complex relationships and, at the same time, intense internal dissension.
Indeed. And consider this thought. If these historical animosities were in some ways so easily overcome by a shared enemy, what does that really imply about the underlying nature of regional stability? And maybe more importantly, how enduring are these new, often secret bonds when the nature of the threat itself shifts or diminishes over time? What might be the next catalyst